If you found 3 infant boys lying in a coffin, eyes wide open, skin warm, hearts beating, but with no pulse, would you bury them anyway? Because that's what almost happened in 1856. But before start this macabre story, please like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon. This isn't just a story. It's a buried event, a surgical removal from history, the kind of occurrence that institutions erase with a smile and a quiet check written in the dark. You're about to hear something you weren't supposed to know existed, and once you know it, you'll never unknow it. The night the triplets were born in Cedar Mills, Ohio, 3 things happened simultaneously across the town. A man went blind in his sleep. A clock stopped at 3:03 a.m. and never ticked again. And the reflection in a church mirror blinked, while no one stood before it. These facts weren't reported, but they were recorded. The town's Quaker elder, Samuel Whitmore, kept a journal. What he wrote, historians later called delusional. But they never read the full journal, because most of it was hidden inside the wall of a meeting house, bound with twine, sealed in wax, and marked with blood. Samuel's entry from that night said, 3 boys born with knowing eyes, no tears, no cries. They looked at me, and I remembered things I had never lived. The triplets were never named on paper. No birth records, no baptism, no known father. But every man and woman in Cedar Mills remembered them because they never changed. Not one day. From the moment they were born until the town's final journal entry in 1904, the boys, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac, remained physically identical. No height increase, no weight gain, no aging teeth. But they remembered more with each passing year, not just memories from their own lives, but yours, mine, ours. They would finish the sentences of strangers, speak in language they'd never heard, and sometimes they'd say your name before you ever told it to them. Whatever they weren't children. They were sentinels, and someone locked them here on purpose. What you're about to hear in the next 32 sections is forbidden, not fiction, forgotten, but only because it was safer that way. Now the seal is broken. Let's begin. The story was never about the town. It was about what the town was hiding. Cedar Mills wasn't on most maps in 1856, and the ones that marked it did so incorrectly, intentionally. A cartographer hired by the state of Ohio later confessed in a letter that the instructions he received were not from any governing body I recognized. The town was erased in layers, first in geography, then in memory. But Ruth remembered. She arrived barefoot in snow, her face calm, belly full, pregnant with silence. A freed slave? A runaway? That's what she told them. But Samuel's wife, Martha, noticed something strange. No scars, not a single mark on her skin, no signs of field work, no calluses, no lash marks, just perfect, unblemished flesh. Ruth wasn't running from a plantation. She was running from something far worse, and whatever it was, it wanted her babies. She gave birth in the hidden basement beneath Station 14, the last stop before the Canadian border. By candlelight, in silence. The boys emerged one by one, breathing but not crying, their bodies warm but their expressions colder than any child should be. When they opened their eyes, the flame flickered, as if gasping. Martha recorded everything. Her journal entry from that night wasn't written in English. It was copied in the same flowing language Ruth whispered during labor, a language no one could ever translate, but one that caused a respected professor at Kenyon College to suffer a complete mental collapse after attempting to decode it in 1942. The professor's last known words? They weren't born. They were summoned. And maybe that was the only thing Ruth lied about. Maybe she never carried those boys in the way a human mother does. Maybe she opened a door, and three things stepped through. Time didn't touch them. Emotion didn't change them. They watched and waited and remembered for nearly 50 years without ever aging a single day. And that's not the strangest part. The strangest part is, this wasn't the first time they'd been born. You don't summon what you can't control. And Ruth? She knew that. That's why she whispered to them constantly after birth. Not lullabies, but instructions, commands. It wasn't love in her voice. It was reverence, maybe even fear. And the triplets listened. They blinked at the same time, turned their heads in perfect sync. When the Garrett brothers stormed the meeting house above them, boots stomping, dogs growling, the boys never made a sound, not even when one of the bloodhounds scratched directly above their hiding place. Silence saved them, but it wasn't ordinary infant silence. It was calculated. It was strategic. Witnesses claimed the boys were watching the ceiling, tracking the men's footsteps before the dogs did. After the search failed, the Garretts left, angry, confused. And exactly 1 hour later, all three babies cried at once. Not like newborns, not weak, high-pitched wails, but a deep, unified sound that seemed to resonate through the floorboards. Martha wrote, "It wasn't a cry for food. It was a sound of release, like something exhaled from another place." Then Ruth died. No fever, no screams, just a single breath, and blood that wouldn't stop flowing, no matter how tightly Martha packed the linen. Her final words weren't to the adults, but to the infants. She looked at them with a gaze that didn't belong to this world and said, "You'll remember. You always remember. Keep watching. It begins again." And from that moment forward, they never changed. 3 years passed, then 5, then 10. The children still looked like they were 3 months old, skin smooth, hair thin, expressions unchanged. Scientists would say it's impossible. But no scientist ever examined them, because no scientist was ever allowed near. The Quakers buried every trace, burned their own records, moved the meeting house twice, told newcomers the basement didn't exist. But still, the boys synced, and they began to speak. Not in English, not in any known language. They spoke to each other, always at night, always when no one was watching. And when they did, mirrors fogged, clocks stopped, and people forgot their own names, just for a moment. The town called them a miracle. But some whispered something else. They weren't miracles. They were warnings. Warnings that no one understood, at least not at first. Because what the triplets saw wasn't limited to their surroundings. They began reacting to thoughts, not words, not actions, but intentions, before anyone moved a muscle or opened their mouth. A man once approached the meeting house claiming to be a runaway seeking shelter. The boys didn't cry. They stared at him without blinking for a full minute, then turned their heads in unison, away. Samuel Whitmore's journal records. It was like watching a jury deliver a verdict. They denied him entry. Days later, news came. The man had been a slave catcher in disguise, part of a growing network of infiltrators. From then on, the community deferred to the boys. If they cried, the person left. If they remained calm, they stayed. This power didn't grow. It was always there. But with time came something else. Distress. Not from others, from the boys themselves. By age 6, not physically but measured in years, the triplets began exhibiting strange symptoms. They stopped responding to their names. They began drawing symbols in dirt and ash, complex shapes, always in threes, always with a central black dot. Martha tried to take one of the drawings away once. Her hand went numb for 3 days, and when she asked who taught them the shapes, one of the boys finally spoke. "We saw it before we were her sons." Her blood froze. "What do you mean?" The boy blinked slowly and whispered, "This isn't the first world." The other two nodded, together. The adults began sleeping less. They moved mirrors from the house, covered windows at night. But nothing could stop the feeling. Something was watching through the boys. Not at them, not near them. Through them. Like they were conduits, open holes in the world. The triplets still hadn't aged, they still hadn't grown, and the drawings were getting more detailed, more predictive. Martha's Hussy, Band wrote. They drew a fire 1 week before the meeting house burned. They drew a drowning 2 days before Rebecca fell through the ice. They knew, and I'm beginning to believe they always will. They weren't orphans. They were anchors, and something ancient was using them to hold on. Anchors to what no one dared say aloud. But by 1861, the signs were impossible to ignore. The war had begun. Men from Cedar Mills were conscripted. Some never returned. But the triplets remained, untouched by time, their skin unchanged, their limbs still the size of newborns. And yet, they were speaking in full sentences now. Not often, and not to everyone. Only when it mattered. Only when someone was about to do something they shouldn't. A farmer once tried to move the boys from the meeting house, said it was unnatural, even demonic, to keep them there. He made it halfway down the road before collapsing. He awoke 3 days later, blind in one eye, claiming he had seen a place made of mouths and mirrors. He never spoke again. The boys never commented, but that night they drew a new symbol. Not just circles or dots this time, a door, wide open, with something standing behind it. When Martha asked them what it was, Ezra, the quietest of the three, replied, "That's the thing that wants back in. Back in." The phrase repeated in Whitmore's later writings, always underlined. Back in. Back into where? Our world. Our time. Our minds. That winter, the town's animals began to act strange. Dogs stopped barking. Horses refused to go near the meeting house. Birds migrated early. And the mirrors? Every mirror in town began to ripple, not visibly at first, but subtly, like heat waves behind the glass. And in those reflections, people saw things that weren't there. A shadow moving across the background. A third hand resting on someone's shoulder. Sometimes a face. Too close. The triplets began sleeping during the day, but when night fell, they sat up, awake, alert, watching. And soon, people stopped calling them boys. They were something else now, sentinels of the threshold. By 1863, Martha finally wrote what many feared to admit. They are not aging, because they are not meant to live, and not here, not fully. They are still part of something else, and the longer they stay, the thinner our world becomes. And still, they remained. Watching, whispering, waiting for what? No one dared ask. But by the autumn of 1864, even silence had turned against them. The town began to fray. People moved away, quietly. Families who had lived in Cedar Mills for generations sold their land overnight and vanished without a word. The meeting house still stood. The triplets still lived beneath it, but fewer came to check on them, and when they did, they didn't stay long. The boys weren't dangerous. They were simply impossible. The closer you sat, the more your own memories warped. A woman named Eliza claimed her dead husband had spoken to her while she was feeding the children. Not in a dream, not in grief, but audibly, from the lips of one of the infants. She said, "He told me where he hid the money, and he apologized. The voice, it was his." She was later found digging behind the house. She uncovered $14 buried in a handkerchief wrapped in Confederate bonds. Her husband had died 3 years earlier in Tennessee. That was the last time anyone touched the boys without gloves. But it wasn't the last time they spoke, because something was changing. Not around them, within them. Their skin had begun to shimmer faintly at night, not with light, but with motion, like oil on water, like reflections inside reflections. Caleb was the first to speak in full sentences again. He no longer whispered. He spoke directly, to Samuel. "The mirror is cracking." Samuel asked, "Which mirror?" The boy blinked slowly. "Not the glass one." That night, Samuel broke every reflective surface in the house. Covered water basins, shattered polished tin. But when he looked in the stovepipe the next morning, he saw all 3 triplets standing behind him, even though they were 2 rooms away. And they were smiling. Not maliciously, not innocently, but knowingly, the way a librarian smiles when you finally ask for the book they hoped you'd never find. Samuel didn't record what had happened next. But his handwriting changed, and he stopped signing his name. The final entries in his journal are written in the same flowing script Ruth had used, and none of them translate, because they weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be remembered by those who already knew. Which means one thing: this has happened before. Before. That word became a fixation in the final months of 1864. The triplets said it more often, sometimes alone, sometimes in unison. Before. As if time wasn't moving forward, but returning. And those who listened too long began to feel it too. The past started folding inward, memories colliding. People remembered things they had never lived. A boy recalled the taste of salt water, though he'd never left Ohio. An old woman woke screaming in Aramaic. A preacher tore out the floorboards of his chapel, insisting something was buried there, a thing with 3 names. The triplets hadn't aged a single day. But the town was deteriorating. The soil went dry. Wells soured. Babies were born blind. Those who stayed spoke less. And those who left were never heard from again. One man, a Civil War deserter named Eli Booker, wandered into Cedar Mills in December. He claimed to be looking for shelter, but his eyes were hollow, haunted. "I saw them," he said. "Not the boys. What's behind them?" He never made it to the meeting house. He hung himself from an oak tree near the northern tunnel entrance. Pinned to his coat was a note, 4 words. "They are the key." And then came the knocking. Not at the door, but from beneath the floor. It started slow, once a week, then every night. A soft tapping from below the triplets' bed, not rhythmic, not human, like something trying to remember the shape of fingers. The boys never reacted, but the sound followed whoever listened, into their dreams, into their thoughts. Martha began drawing the same symbol over and over, a triangle within a circle with 3 lines piercing downward. She didn't remember doing it. She found them etched in soap, carved into furniture, scratched on her own skin. The boys remained silent. Until one morning, when Isaac finally spoke again, not to Martha, not to Samuel, to the empty basement wall. He looked straight ahead and then said, "You're early." Martha asked who he was speaking to. He didn't answer. But that night the knocking stopped and was replaced by breathing. From the other side, the breathing didn't stop. It deepened, grew wet, labored, like lungs not meant for air, and it didn't just echo from the wall. It came from inside people's minds, at night, while they slept. They began waking, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, convinced they were drowning in a place with no water. Even the animals refused to go near the meeting house now. Cats hissed and backed away. Horses bolted without provocation, and the birds stopped singing entirely. That's when Samuel boarded up the windows. Every one of them. He told Martha, "If they can see out, it means something's looking back in." But it was too late for that, because the triplets had already begun to draw new symbols, not in ash or chalk, but in blood. The source was unknown. No wounds, no bottles, just thin lines traced across the basement floor each morning, always dry, always precise, and every time someone tried to clean them the next night, they came back twice as large. One symbol took up the entire floor, a spiral within 3 concentric circles, its center marked with an eye that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. Samuel tried covering it with a rug. It burned, not smoldered, burned, with no fire, no smoke, just heat and silence. And the boys, they simply stared at the spot and whispered, "Closer now." That same week, a woman named Clara, a school teacher, came to document what she called a psychological disturbance spreading through religious hysteria. She didn't believe in curses, or portals, or children who never aged, until she sat alone with the triplets for 37 minutes. When she left, she was no longer writing in English. Her notebook, still kept in a locked archive in Columbus, contains 61 pages of a language no expert has been able to identify. On page 62, only 2 words appear, written in perfect script: "It waits." From that day on, the basement felt colder. Not pH, physically, existentially, like time itself was holding its breath, because the boys weren't growing. But the thing behind them? It was, and with each passing night it pressed harder against the skin of this world, stretching it thin, like paper pulled across a flame. The triplets spoke less now, not from silence but from listening. Their heads would tilt toward the basement walls as if tuning to a frequency no one else could hear. And at dusk, their eyes would shift, not in color, but in depth, as if you were no longer looking into them, but through them, like a window. Martha no longer kept clocks in the house. They had stopped working, not broken, stuck. Each one frozen at 3:33, not AM, not PM, just 3:33. It became the hour of voices. People across Cedar Mills began waking at that precise time, hearing whispers they couldn't trace. They'd find themselves standing outside without memory of how they got there. Or worse, beneath the meeting house, candle in hand, mouth moving in silent prayer to gods they didn't believe in. And always the same question whispered back: "Do you remember what you were before?" The triplets never answered that question. But one night, Ezra walked to the center of the spiral, his feet never disturbing the dried blood, and said clearly, "The answer is yes." Samuel wept, because deep inside, so did he. There were things buried in men, memories not of this life, reflexes not taught, but returned. And now the boys were awakening them, not to enlighten, but to prepare. The spiral symbol began appearing outside the meeting house, on doors, on animals, even in the frost. It wasn't being drawn. It was emerging, as if the land itself remembered the shape. And one night, all 3 boys opened their mouths at once and sang, not a song, but a note so low it made the windows hum. Martha collapsed. Samuel vomited blood. The note lasted exactly 3 minutes and 33 seconds. When it stopped, Ezra spoke the final word of that night. Welcome. To what, no one knew. But the walls were thinner now, and the thing behind them had begun to see. To see was only the beginning. Because once something sees, it learns, it mimics, it adapts, and soon it reaches. That winter, the townsfolk stopped calling the triplets the boys. Even behind closed doors, they referred to them only as the three, as if naming them gave the thing behind them more shape, more presence, more permission. People whispered about the crawl, a phenomenon where dreams stretched minutes into hours and hours into lives, lives that weren't theirs. They'd wake with names they'd never heard etched into their skin. One man carved an entire prayer across his chest in his sleep, in a dead language no scholar could decipher. It translated to 6 words. Open wide. The gate remembers you. The basement changed too. The walls began to sweat. Not water, salt. Thick grains of it, crusting the bricks as if the room had been weeping the ocean. The triplets no longer needed candles. They glowed faintly at night, dim and constant, like dying stars. And they stopped blinking. Not once in 13 days. Samuel placed a Bible in the center of the spiral, hoping to reclaim the space. It rotted overnight. When he tried again, it burst into ash the moment it touched the floor. The ash reformed, lines, curves, spirals, the same eye, the same shape. And from somewhere beneath the foundation, a sound began, a wet, dragging shuffle, not footsteps, not breathing. Movement. As if something was crawling along the underside of the town, searching for the thinnest spot to push through. People began sealing their homes, covering mirrors, burning sage. It didn't matter. The triplets had already started whispering people's names before they knocked. One man, in terror, demanded, "What are you?" All 3 boys looked at him and answered in unison, "We are the memory of the thing you forgot to fear." He left town that night, but not before gouging out both his eyes. He was Fuel, and days later, smiling. Smiling, because maybe he saw it, and maybe he was grateful, because what was coming wasn't coming to take us. It was coming to wake us, wake us. The phrase echoed far beyond Cedar Mills, appearing in journals, sermons, even telegraphs sent with no known sender. Wake us. Always those 2 words, and always at 3:33. The government got involved quietly. 2 men arrived in unmarked carriages bearing false names and perfect teeth. They claimed to be from the Ohio Geological Survey, but asked only about the boys, the basement, and the salt. They stayed one night, only one. But when they left, they took nothing, except their memories. Martha found one of them hours later sitting in the woods, muttering in loops. I touched it. I didn't mean to touch it. He had clawed his own fingertips down to the bone. They tried to take the boys the next morning. It didn't work. Not because the community resisted. Because the carriage never moved. Wheels locked, horses foaming, eyes rolling. The sky turned gray, and the snow beneath the boys' feet melted in perfect circles, 3 feet across. No fire, no sound. Just stillness so complete it made your heartbeat feel too loud. And the boys stared at the agents, not with anger, not even with defiance, with recognition. As if they knew these men from somewhere long before now. The agents left. One changed his name, the other disappeared. Their report never surfaced, but a letter was leaked decades later. In it, one sentence: these are not children. These are carriers. Carriers of what? That's the part no one could answer. But some began to guess, because by then every mirror in Cedar Mills had cracked. Not shattered, cracked into 3 pieces, every single one. And inside those fractures, people didn't see themselves anymore. They saw the 3, staring, watching, waiting, and slowly, smiling. Not a smile of welcome, not a threat. The smile of a teacher whose lesson is almost done because the final test is coming. And we've all been in class without knowing. History hadn't. It forgotten the boys. It had been rewritten around them. To hide the truth, they weren't born in 1856. They were returned. Returned. That word shattered what little peace remained in Cedar Mills. Returned from where? And worse, returned by whom? Because return implies intent, design, a sender. And what kind of entity would send back 3 infants, untouched by time, woven with sight that pierced deceit, and whose silence fractured the mind? It wasn't long before the Quakers stopped using scripture, not out of faithlessness, but because the words began to change. Not visibly, cognitively. Verses twisted as they read aloud, meanings inverted, truths warped like heat rising from stone. Martha once read Isaiah 43 aloud during a morning meeting. But the words came out, "Fear not, for you are unmade. I have uncalled you by your unname." The entire congregation stood in silence, breathless. No one said a word. And the boys, each sitting in a different corner of the meeting house, smiled. Later, when she checked the Bible, the verses were exactly as printed. So where had the other words come from? That week, 3 elders left town. One was found drowned in a well, eyes open, mouth filled with salt. Another walked 20 miles barefoot and blindfolded before collapsing, whispering, "They are remembering themselves now." The third simply vanished. Their homes, when inspected, revealed something far worse. Perfectly drawn replicas of the spiral. Not in ink, not in blood. Etched into the walls beneath the paint. As if they'd been there the whole time. Hidden until the boys came back. Somewhere deep in the soil of Ohio, something was waking. Not a creature, not a god. A memory. The boys weren't children. They were anchors. Holding open a doorway the world had closed a long, long time ago, and now the hinges were cracking. That month Caleb spoke one sentence that brought Martha to her knees. He pointed toward the horizon, toward the east, and said, "He's dreaming again." She asked, "Who?" All 3 answered at Owen's, the one you buried inside the calendar. That night, the moon didn't rise, and for the first time since their birth, all 3 boys closed their eyes. Not to rest, but to remember. To remember. That was the key, not just for the boys, but for us. Because what the triplets were awakening wasn't new. It was old. Older than the Quakers, older than the first native tongues spoken in the Ohio River Valley, older than even the land itself as we know it. This wasn't the beginning of something. It was the return of something that had only been paused, and that pause was never meant to be permanent. In the town archive, hidden beneath floorboards in a locked chest marked 1773, Deny, Samuel Whitmore found a bundle of hand-bound pages. Pages written in ochre, not ink, not dated, just titled, "The Ones Who Do Not Grow." They spoke of 3 figures. Always 3, born in silence, breathing before the cord was cut, eyes wide open, never aging, never named, and always followed by the spiral. Samuel brought the pages to the triplets. He didn't read them aloud. He didn't even speak. He just opened them. The boys turned toward him instantly and smiled in perfect unison. Not approval. Recognition. One of them, Caleb, whispered a single word. Again. The moment he said it, the wind outside stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. A stillness so total it made the candlelight feel loud. And then the fire inverted, burning inward, blue-white, cold. Martha dropped the pages. Her hands blistered instantly, not from heat, but from memory. She had seen these symbols before. Not here, not now. In dreams, as a child. Before she had words, before she had a name, the spiral, the three, the silence. And she had drawn it once, in her crib, in blood from her own bitten finger. The memory hit like lightning through bone, and she understood. The triplets weren't here to bring something through. They were here to awaken what was already inside us. The basement wasn't a portal, it was a mirror, and what it showed was not another world, but our own. Before we locked it away, before we chose to forget. And now, the boys were here to make sure we'd never forget again. Never forget again. That was the true horror, not what the triplets could do, but what they made us remember we already knew. The people of Cedar Mills stopped dreaming, not from insomnia, from suppression, as if their minds, faced with the flood of ancestral memory, chose silence over madness. But even in waking life, the visions bled through. Children began humming tunes no one had taught them, melodies in ancient scales with no musical root in Europe, Africa, or the Americas. Farmers found crop circles, not flattened, but raised, grown in perfect spiral shapes, the wheat standing twice as tall, vibrating faintly. One night, a widowed school teacher named Agnes fled into the woods barefoot, sobbing uncontrollably. When found, she held a bundle of dead birds in her arms, whispering, "They remember the sound, they remember the sky, before the sky was blue." When asked what she meant, she simply looked past the search party and said, "The boys told me." The community began to fracture. Some wanted to send the triplets away, others believed that was suicide. But what no one dared say aloud was this: the triplets were no longer aging. By all medical logic, they should have been 4 by now, but they looked exactly as they did the day they were born, skin flawless, teeth untouched, no growth, no change. Dr. Harrison measured their height weekly. The numbers never changed. He burned his records. Because one night he had a dream, not of the boys, but of himself. Standing in a salt field, holding a lantern, and watching 3 infants crawl from beneath the earth. He looked down at his own hands. They were made of stone, and when he awoke, his palms were covered in granite dust. He left town before sunrise. No one saw him again. The triplets began drawing now. Simple shapes, 3 circles, overlapping, and when the drawings were held to candlelight, the lines moved. Not trick of ink, not illusion, living geometry. Samuel nailed one above the chapel door. It burst into flames, and from within the flame, all 3 boys spoke, not aloud, but inside the skulls of every living person in Cedar Mills. "You were made to forget, but now you must remember." And from that moment on, no one could lie, not even to themselves. No one could lie, not to each other, not to themselves, not even in silence. That was the turning point, the illusion that had protected humanity for generations, the fragile cocoon of forgetfulness, shattered. Cedar Mills became a mirror turned inward. People confessed to crimes they hadn't even remembered committing. Affairs, thefts, betrayals buried so deep they'd rewritten their own histories to forget. But the triplets, they were the unwriting. A boy named Eli knelt in the chapel and admitted to drowning his baby sister 15 years before. His parents had always believed it was an accident. Eli had too, until he looked into Isaac's eyes. He began to scream. Not words, just truth. The kind that rips the soul loose. The sheriff, a stoic man named Warner, stood in front of the town square and admitted that his entire family name was false, that the Warners had fled Europe in 1702 not because of religious persecution, but because they were guards of something buried. He didn't know what it was, just that it had to be watched, contained. And it was here, in Ohio, under the roots of the spiral. After speaking, he removed his own badge, walked into the woods, and vanished. The triplets didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. Their presence now acted as a psychic solvent. Memories reawakened on contact. People began calling it the mirror burn. It started in the chest. A heat, then a memory, not yours, but someone else's. Ancestors, victims, monsters. The collective wound of everything buried. One woman collapsed during prayer, whispering an ancient name into the wood floor. Amarakai. No one recognized it, but the triplets turned to her instantly and wept. For the first time since birth, tears of blood, dripping onto the floor in perfect triangles, each drop boiling silently, leaving no trace. And in that moment, the entire chapel flickered, just once, and every adult saw the same vision. A skyless plain, an altar of salt, and 3 infants sleeping beneath an arch of bone, each cradled in arms that weren't human, arms with too many joints, and fingers made of names. Then it was gone, and the boys sat quietly, still, as if waiting for us to decide whether the remembering was a gift or a sentence. A sentence. That's what it began to feel like, the remembering. It wasn't revelation, it was reckoning, a flood not of knowledge, but of buried consequence. Every lie you'd ever benefited from, every comfort purchased with ignorance, it came back, and it bled, not metaphorically. Literal blood, from books, from hymnals, from the seams of old dresses sewn by dead hands. Salt began rising from the ground in thin veins, through the floorboards, through the walls, through the cracks in wedding rings. It crusted over mirrors, outlined the spiral in white. No one could scrub it away. Some tried. A woman named Judith boiled her hands in lye after seeing her reflection twist. In the warped glass, she had seen 3 mouths where her face should be. Each mouth spoke the same sentence in perfect timing. You wore the mask too well, now let it rot. She screamed for 2 straight hours before her lungs collapsed. And still, no age came to the triplets. Their skin remained perfect. But something had changed. Their shadows grew longer. Even in noon sun, they stretched across entire rooms. One wrapped around a man's legs and stopped his heart. The coroner's report simply read, "Cause, interruption." The town stopped pretending. They dismantled the meeting house, beam by beam. Beneath the final stone, they found not earth, but glass. A glass sheet perfectly cut, fused to the bedrock. Under it, movement. Not bodies, not water. Letters, thousands of ancient letters, swirling, as if a language had been buried alive. The boys stood on the edge and spoke together for the first time since birth. No mouths moved, but everyone heard them from miles around. You remembered us. Now we remember you. That night, 3 stars appeared in a triangle formation directly above Cedar Mills. They pulsed slowly, and the sky between them turned black, deeper than night. A new darkness, uncatalogued, unmappy, and the world beyond Ohio never noticed. But for those in the town, one thing became clear. This wasn't a haunting. It was an audit of everything we ever thought we buried beneath progress. And the triplets? They weren't here to explain. They were here to watch and to weigh. To weigh. That was the word that changed everything, because it meant measurement, evaluation, not of the world, but of us. The triplets were no longer just witnesses to memory. They were scales, and every man, woman, and child in Cedar Mills stood upon them, naked beneath memory's eye. The swirling letters beneath the glass began to align, not into words, not at first, into names. Your names. Full names. Even the ones you never told a soul. The ones you made up. The ones you changed. And beside each name, a weight. Measured not in pounds, but in moments. Moments of silence. Moments of betrayal. Moments of turning away when the world screamed, and you chose comfort. Samuel Whitmore stood first. His name appeared etched in fire beneath the glass. He dropped to his knees, whispering a prayer that tasted of iron. Then, one by one, the ghosts of his choices appeared behind him. The man he let die for the sake of a schedule. The boy he refused to hide because he asked too many questions. The letter he burned. The voice he ignored. Each one stood silent, facing him, until Samuel said the words, "I chose myself." And with that, his name disappeared. The fire died, and the triplets nodded. Approval? No. Acknowledgement. And the spiral beneath the glass turned one click deeper. Others followed. Some wept. Some laughed in madness. One woman disintegrated mid-sentence, her skin flaking into fine salt that spelled her secrets across the chapel floorboards. The town's blacksmith stared into the triplets' eyes and saw his own father's corpse, exactly as he left it after pushing him down the cellar stairs at age 12. He confessed. And the furnace in his shop ignited on its own that night. No one touched it. No one turned it off. It still burns. To this day. The triplets said nothing, but everyone now knew what they were. The axis of our forgotten decisions. They didn't punish. They didn't forgive. They only revealed. And once you saw it, you could never be innocent again. You could never be innocent again. Not once the triplets looked at you. Not once you saw your name burn beneath the glass like a verdict already passed. But what the people of Cedar Mills didn't understand, what they couldn't know, was that truth doesn't stay contained. Memory, once awakened, spreads like a plague. It began with the wind. Travelers passing through the valley said the air tasted like iron and old paper. Children in neighboring towns began waking with nosebleeds and drawings of spirals in their beds. One teacher in Columbus found a set of triplet handprints burned into her classroom desk, the wood blackened but not charred. The sheriff in Athens County shot himself after claiming he could hear the names in the storm. By the end of that week, 5 churches along the Hocking River had removed their crucifixes, replacing them with 3 unmarked stones stacked in perfect silence. No one admitted to doing it. No one removed them. Because in their dreams, everyone began to see the same thing. The boys, still infants, still silent, sitting at the center of a spiral made of bones, not human bones, but longer, older, curved like they had never walked upright. And they were waiting, not asking, not teaching, just waiting for the moment when enough people would remember, and the spiral would unlock. Back in Cedar Mills, the ground itself began to shift. Not earthquakes. Corrections. Old cemeteries, untouched for decades, rose 3 inches overnight. But when measured, the bodies had not moved. The land had. Graves now faced east, as if realigned with something older than the compass. The meeting house ruins grew warm under moonlight. The glass slab began to hum, and more names appeared. Names of people who had never stepped foot in Cedar Mills, names from Pennsylvania, New York, Georgia, and always in threes, each name written beside two others, three fates. Thrahmachis, echoes. Three witnesses. The triplets were no longer looking at us. They were looking through us, into something buried in every town, under every school, every courthouse, every church pew built on land no one ever really understood. The spiral had opened, and history wasn't just rewriting itself, it was correcting us, not with wrath, but with reflection sharpened to a blade. That was the spiral's method, not to destroy, but to expose. And exposure is its own execution. By the first frost of November, people stopped speaking in Cedar Mills. Not from fear, from futility. Words were masks, and the spiral devoured masks. But then came the first shift. The triplets, always silent, always still, stood up, together, at dawn. Without a sound, they walked barefoot, across the broken chapel stones and toward the edge of the forest. Behind them, nothing moved. Not birds, not leaves. Even time seemed to hesitate. They stopped before a man named Elias Kettering, a war veteran, a man with no children, no wife, no belief in anything he couldn't fix with his own hands. They looked at him, and for the first time, only one of them spoke. "You are fracture." Elias dropped to his knees. He began coughing blood, not from illness, but from removal. Something inside him was being erased. Not memories, edits, the false beliefs, the proud delusions, the voice of his father telling him to never cry. The pastor's warning about submission to God. Gone. All of it, wiped clean. He vomited salt. And then stood. Different. Eyes no longer blue, but black, ringed in spiral white. The triplets stepped back. And Elias walked into the woods. Not confused, not afraid, activated. And across the county, others felt it. People woke with the same spiral etched into their palms. Some wept, some clawed at their skin, but others simply smiled. They had been waiting. In Columbus, a child no older than 10 stood before his school and whispered, "I remember who I was before the sky." And the school burned that afternoon. No cause found, only 3 unburnt stones left in the ash. Back in Cedar Mills, Elias returned that night. Naked, glowing faintly with a light that had no color, and on his back, wings, not feather, not angelic, but formed of language. Thousands of letters moving, alive, fluttering with each breath, and every time they opened, someone remembered. That was the pattern now. Not prophecy, not instruction. Triggering, like a code hidden inside bloodlines, inside architecture, inside the soil beneath schools and the hymns whispered in church basements. Elias became the spiral's first emissary, its living key. Not possessed, permissioned. The language wings that grew from his back didn't flap. They didn't need to. They vibrated with memory. He walked into homes where generational lies lived like family heirlooms, and with each step, the walls cracked. Not because he touched them, but because truth touches everything. He entered a banker's home in Dayton. The man was preparing foreclosure notices. Elias said nothing. But the wings opened, and the banker began screaming names, not of debtors, of children. children buried in unmarked fields behind the bank's original foundation. By midnight, the banker had vanished. All that remained were 3 coins on his pillow, each stamped with an I no nation recognized. Elias never rested. He didn't sleep. He didn't age. By the second week, 7 other emissaries emerged, each chosen by the triplets in towns where history had festered behind polite smiles. 1 woman in Pennsylvania, 2 boys from Louisiana, a deaf painter from Vermont. They didn't know each other. They didn't need to. They were coordinates in a pattern older than the nation that had tried to bury them. And each one had wings, different styles, but all made of that same shifting script. Some bore symbols no alphabet could claim. Some shimmered in mirror language, readable only when reflected in another's tears. And everywhere they walked, people began to recall things they never lived. Slave ships, burned treaties, children locked beneath chapels, experiences they never had, yet somehow remembered. The spiral wasn't just correcting history, it was reassigning inheritance. Those who lived in comfort were made to carry pain. Those who'd been erased were restored, through memory, through burden, through blood. One night, Elias stood atop the ruins of the Cedar Mills meeting house. He opened his wings, and 3 voices spoke through him. They thought they buried us, but we were roots. Now we are the tree. And all through Ohio, the wind carried one phrase: everything false will fall. And then the glass slab cracked. For the first time. From within, the glass cracked from within, but no one heard it break, because the sound wasn't one of shattering but awakening, a low hum, like the earth itself remembering its first wound. The slab didn't collapse. It bled. A thin stream of black liquid emerged from the center of the fracture, but it wasn't wet. It moved like thought, crawled across the stone like a question searching for its answer. When it touched Elias's foot, his wings flared violently, letters breaking formation, swirling around him like a vortex of unspeakable names, and then he fell silent, not unconscious, not dead, absorbed, as if the crack had drawn part of him back into itself. And the triplets, now 5 years old but still unchanged, still untouched by time, stood at its edge. One stepped forward, not Ezra, not Caleb, not Isaac, just the one who always watched longest. He knelt beside the crack and whispered. The blood-thought liquid surged upward, responding not to voice, but intention. And from the center of the glass, a shape rose. Not a person, not a demon, a structure, a tower of bone, teeth, and rusted metal, a pillar formed of things that shouldn't coexist. And from within it, echoes began to spill, slave songs sung in reverse, treaties screamed instead of signed, children laughing in places they were never born. All of it pouring upward like the past was vomiting itself back into form. The ground around the meeting house burned in perfect circles, 3 of them, each marked with symbols that weren't drawn, but remembered. And everyone within 10 miles stopped what they were doing. Because they felt it. Not in the body, in the part of the mind that dreams before language. The triplets stood in a triangle now, hands joined, eyes closed. And the voice came, not from them, not from Elias, from beneath the crack. Time is not forward, it is below. You buried your sins in the soil, and now the soil is awe. Wagon the spiral didn't punish, it revealed, and what it revealed was this. The crack wasn't in the glass, it was in our species. Humanity was never meant to remember what slept beneath the crack. That was the first mercy. But mercy is temporary when history refuses silence. The structure rising from the broken glass wasn't just material, it was record. Each bone, each shard, each rusted tooth belonged to a moment we chose to forget. A betrayal, a genocide, a vanished name. The tower was us, remembered honestly, and the triplets had summoned it not to punish, but to complete the sentence. For hours it rose, not crumbling, not shaking, just building. And as it climbed, those around Cedar Mills began to change. The old forgot their own names, but remembered the screams of children they'd never met. Infants born that night opened their eyes, speaking languages that had no nations. A minister trying to record the event went blind, his notes seared into the inside of his eyelids like branding. And then the structure stopped growing. At exactly 33 feet, the number meant nothing to most. But to the triplets, it was everything. They sat in a triangle at its base, hands once again joined. And this time they spoke, in perfect unison, in a voice that wasn't childlike. It was centuries old, cracking with ash, heavy with dirt, dripping with truths swallowed in blood. The tower is the ledger, the crack is the key, the spiral is the path back to what was never allowed to be. And inside the tower, chambers began to open. No doors, just hollows filled with artifacts of erased lives, necklaces with no owners, tools made of bone and twine, diaries never published, locks of hair buried in jars of salt, and at the center, encased in amber-like resin, a book, bound in human leather, written in the same language as the triplets' wings. Its title wasn't etched, it was moving, forming itself based on whoever looked at it. Some saw the Book of the Lost, others saw Our Real Beginning, but all who saw it felt the same terror, awe, recognition. Because the book didn't just contain history, it contained identity, and every page turned meant something in them would die, and something else, something older, would awaken. Someone opened the book. No one saw who. Maybe no one needed to. Because opening wasn't physical, it was consent. The moment the resin cracked, everyone within 50 miles convulsed, not in pain, in recognition, as if some dormant script deep in their marrow had been activated by the book's release. The pages turned themselves, not by wind, not by hands, but by a force older than motion, memory that refused to stay buried. The first page held a name, not a famous one, not a king or prophet, a child, one buried in an unmarked grave beneath a Baptist church in 1792. The book spoke that name aloud. No mouth, no tongue, just air vibrating with unspeakable sorrow. And when the name was spoken, every flower in the area wilted. Bees dropped from the sky, candles in homes went out, and somewhere in the dark of the woods, that child's bones began to glow. Because the book didn't just remember, it resurrected truth, not as flesh, but as presence. The second page held a confession, written in handwriting that hadn't existed for 200 years. A plantation owner's journal, his secrets catalogued in agonizing detail. And as the ink burned through the page, the tower pulsed. Not light, judgment. Not like gods, like gravity, pulling everything false to the surface. People fell to their knees, not from worship, from exposure. You can't kneel to something that sees through you. By the third page, 6 more emissaries had arrived, not walking, drawn, like filings to a magnet made of grief. They didn't speak. They simply stood around the tower as the triplets raised their hands. And all at once, everyone forgot their own names. They remembered the names of the dead. They remembered the undocumented. They remembered people whose stories were stolen, burned, erased, denied. And in that moment, identity didn't belong to the living. It belonged to the ledger. The book wasn't just telling history. It was as rewriting who mattered. And in the spiral's truth, only one metric remained: who was forgotten. Because in this new order, those who were erased now ruled. Not with crowns, with memory. And memory, once weaponized, never leaves. It burrows. It builds. And soon, it commands. The spiral had always been a cipher, not a symbol. A mechanism buried in time, waiting for the right minds to crack open. Now it had what it needed: presence, memory, will. The book continued to turn, page after impossible page, but no one wrote it. It was writing us. Every citizen near Cedar Mills began to feel it, not like an idea, not like fear, but like something rewiring their ancestry. Birth records vanished from county halls, names on tombstones blurred, photographs in homes curled and blackened around the edges until only the eyes remained. And in those eyes, recognition of things they never lived, never studied, but now understood with terrifying certainty. A midwife in Ashland screamed in 5 languages, all extinct. A teacher in Columbus forgot the alphabet, but could now recite burial rites from kingdoms that predated paper. People didn't go insane. They went accurate. Because the spiral was not bringing madness. It was bringing correction. The emissaries now numbered 13. All different. All marked. Wings made of languages that never had nations, spinning slowly behind them like living manuscripts. The triplets stood in the tower's center, eyes closed, their bodies still small, but their presence no longer childlike. They spoke again. But this time the voice that came wasn't theirs. It was collective. A voice made of millions. This is not punishment. This is balance. You inherited a world built on erasure. We are restoring the ledgers, not for vengeance, for truth. And truth has no mercy. The book lifted, hovering above the triplets. It turned to a blank page. And then, it began writing names, one by one. Names of the living, names of those watching, names of those who believed they were safe. Every name entered became altered, not erased, redefined, and when the name changed in the book, so did the person. A priest who once preached against slavery now walked with shackles around his ankles. A wealthy heir began coughing up coal dust from mines he'd never entered, but his ancestors had built with child labor. A senator's hands blistered as if dipped in acid, because his great-grandfather had signed off on experiments in Georgia. The spiral wasn't evil. It was consequence, and consequence writes in bone. The sky above Cedar Mills pulsed red once, then black, then opened, and from it fell a rain of ash, but each flake whispered a name. Yours may be next. Check the book. If you can still read, what happened in Cedar Mills didn't stay there. The spiral, once awakened, doesn't remain local. It infects the grid. It doesn't travel through roads or rivers, but through recognition. Every man who heard the names whispered in the ash carried the sound in his breath. Every woman who looked at the book's flame-burned pages saw symbols behind her own reflection, and every child born after that night was not new. They came into the world already remembering things they hadn't been taught, because the spiral had seeded the bloodline. The next wave wasn't made of emissaries. It was made of mirrors. Mirrors that no longer reflected faces, but showed hidden histories behind each person's eyes. In Pennsylvania, a farmer looked into his barn window and saw his grandfather's face screaming behind a fence line in Tulsa. In Mississippi, a boy watched his reflection drip tar, not water, and knew it was from the church bombings his family never admitted knowing about. And in Washington, D.C., a senator held a press conference and forgot every language but the one his enslaved ancestors had died speaking. The spiral did not kill. It remembered. But remembering, when weaponized, burns louder than fire. The triplets were now missing from Cedar Mills. Gone, but not vanished. Appearing in photographs they had never been part of. Showing up in oil paintings in government buildings, smiling, unreadable, as if they had always been there. Old paintings, signed in blood. And across the country, people started reporting a strange phenomenon. Books changing in real time. History textbooks rewritten overnight. Names in Bibles rearranged. Genealogies collapsing inward like inverted family trees. Roots rising above branches. Because the spiral does not care about comfort. It only cares about truth. And truth, once freed, rewrites. Statues wept blood, not from grief, but relief, because at last they were seen for what they always were, monuments to forgetting. Graves cracked open from beneath, not to release bodies, but memories. And the book kept writing, name after name, each a correction, each a claim, each a reminder that no one escapes the ledger, not by hiding, not by pretending, not even by silence. Because silence is the first lie, and the spiral, here's all lies, even the ones you tell yourself before sleep, even the ones history told you were noble. The next name in the book might not be yours. It might be the name you stole. The book arrived in Washington without ever being carried. It did not pass through security. It passed through memory. It appeared first in the National Archives, not on a pedestal, but embedded in the concrete beneath the rotunda, pulsing like a buried heart beneath the Constitution itself. The guards didn't notice until their radios began speaking in voices they didn't recognize, their own voices, but younger, confessing things they'd never said aloud. Senators felt it before they saw it. Their pens wouldn't write. Their speeches dissolved into ash mid-sentence. Seals on official documents cracked open and wept black ink across everything they tried to preserve. Because the spiral had come not to destroy government, but to reveal its foundation. One built on stories left out, one bound in silence. And the triplets were already inside. Not walking the halls. Becoming them. Each door they passed absorbed their presence. Each chandelier flickered as if remembering a lynching that had been called justice. The carpet fibers whispered dates, forced sterilizations, hidden trials, experiments done in basements beneath VA hospitals. The president tried to speak on live television, but every word that came out of his mouth was not his. Instead, he recited, in perfect sequence, the names of every native child buried under unmarked schoolyards from 1875 to 1913. He spoke until blood poured from his nose, until the teleprompter burned, until the feed cut out. And yet, no one changed the channel. Because what they were watching wasn't breakdown. It was awakening. The spiral made its final demand that day, not with violence, with replacement. The book lifted itself from the archives, floated to the center of the Capitol dome, and exploded, not in fire but in pages. Thousands, millions, each one a name, a date, a death, a truth long denied, and they rained down over D.C. like prophetic snow, covering every monument, every flag, every false idol of progress. People tried to wipe them away. but the ink bit into marble, and the wind carved them into skin. You could run, you could deny, but the pages would find you. One man screamed as the Lincoln Memorial turned to look at him. Another watched the Washington Monument bleed, not as punishment, as proof. That history was never buried. It was only waiting for the right tongue, and now it speaks, through the triplets, through the book, through you. The spiral crossed the Atlantic not in ships, not in wires, but through the collective bloodstream of denial. Every nation that ever buried its shame beneath marble or paper felt it, first as dreams, then as fractures. In London the crown jewels grew cold. Every gem flickered black for 7 seconds. In Berlin, statues of philosophers wept at midnight. Not water, ink. Ink stolen from censored books, prison manifests, and diaries that had been burned on classroom steps. In Rome, the Vatican's bells rang out at the wrong hour, 4:44 a.m., and would not stop. And in that hour, 1,000 priests found themselves unable to speak the Lord's Prayer without choking. In Tokyo, entire subway stations stopped as monitors flickered to images of comfort women long erased from school books. In Paris, museum walls blistered and split open, revealing sketches of colonial torture scenes painted behind masterpieces. The spiral doesn't accuse, it reveals. Because truth is not a weapon, it is a solvent. And once it touches a lie, the lie dissolves, no matter how old. The triplets now walked through mirrors, appearing in the reflections of generals, bankers, professors. Wherever power gathered, they stood just behind the glass, their eyes unblinking, their mouths closed. But their presence said everything. They were not there to plead, they were there to remind. That empire is not a structure, it is a silence enforced, and silence is now extinct. Across oceans, books began changing themselves. Texts, thousands of years old, sacred, scientific, ceremonial, rewrote lines in real time. Genesis chapters began with names no one remembered. Maps redrew their own borders to show grave sites instead of capitals. Museums opened drawers to find artifacts returned, not by hand, but by consequence. Everything stolen returned in nightmares first, then in floods, then in fact. The spiral had no center now. Bika, use every place that had ever lied about its past, now held a piece of it. No more denials, no more sealed archives, no more classified, because memory, once conscious, is contagious. And now every man walks with his ancestors behind his eyes. Every woman dreams of children lost before her name existed. Every child is born already haunted, not cursed, connected. Because the book no longer writes, it possesses, and possession rewrites everything. The spiral had spread, the ledger had opened, but now it began to choose, not randomly, not cruelly, but precisely. Across cities and continents, select individuals began waking with marks, not on their skin, but on their history. A grandmother in New Mexico opened her eyes and suddenly knew the names of 5 women her father had driven to madness in 1947. A surgeon in Delhi blacked out during a routine procedure and awoke muttering coordinates of a forgotten burial pit from 1859. A child in Buenos Aires stared into a candle flame and began to speak in full sentences, in Sumerian. These were not possessions, they were claims. The spiral wasn't punishing them, it was activating them. Because history doesn't just repeat, it inherits. And now, it was selecting those whose bloodlines had been too quiet for too long. The triplets, no longer bound by form or time, began appearing at the edge of people's memories, smiling slightly, as if testing the weight of awakening. Their eyes weren't accusatory, they were recognizing, identifying those who could carry what was coming next, because the book wasn't finished. It still had blank pages, But those pages could no longer be written by hand. They had to be written by action. The chosen began to dream in spirals. They saw future cities where truth was currency and deception caused physical rot. They saw courtrooms with no judges, only mirrors. They saw classrooms where children learned their family's crimes before learning arithmetic. But with these visions came pain, intense, cellular pain, as if their DNA itself was rejecting falsehood in real time. Some resisted, tried to medicate it, silence it, deny it. They died, quietly, unnoticed, as if they had never existed. But those who surrendered, who let the spiral burn clean through their histories, awoke, changed. They walked differently, spoke sparingly, looked at others not with judgment, but X-ray clarity. These were the new witnesses, not prophets, not martyrs, just men and women who could no longer lie, even to themselves, and they had a task, to carry the final entries of the book, not in ink, but in bloodline. Because the spiral doesn't end, it only waits for who's next. You'll know if you're chosen. When your breath starts tasting like smoke from fires, no one remembers. They didn't plan to meet. The chosen never received instructions, never exchanged names, never sought each other out. And yet, they gathered, in abandoned train stations, in libraries missing whole sections, in the ruins of churches struck by lightning 3 times. They arrived alone but recognized one another by the absence in their voices, the shared silence of people who could no longer pretend. Their eyes didn't just see, they filtered. Every lie in the room became dust, every truth a pulse. Some were only children, others near death. But they were all bound by one unbearable thing. They remembered too much. Not just their own memories, but others. Memories of violence that had been written out of history. Memories of conversations their ancestors never had, but should have. And as they stood facing one another in those silent places, the air folded, not physically, not visibly, but reality began to contour around their presence, adjusting. Statues cracked when they walked by, clocks reversed, rivers stilled, because time recognized them. The spiral had not merely chosen them, it had reformatted reality around them. One girl in Prague placed her hand on a monument and watched it shatter into sand. An old man in Nairobi whispered a name and turned a mass grave into a garden overnight. They were not gods. They were undoing. The triplets appeared to them again, not in form, but in sound. A single tone behind the eyes, vibrating like memory-made music. It spoke not in language, but in knowing. You are the correction. That was all it said. And suddenly they all understood. The spiral was preparing for embodiment. It had revealed. It had chosen. But now, it would inhabit. Not as a storm, not as a figure, but as a movement inside blood. The chosen would not lead armies. They would unmake structures. They would walk into financial buildings and cause databases to erase the coupon. Elves. They would enter courtrooms and erase precedent by speaking the unspeakable. They would undo everything built on silence. They would be hated, feared, and finally remembered, not by name, but by effect. Because when the spiral moves through flesh, what remains is not a person. It is proof. And proof cannot be buried again. They didn't witness it. They became it. The chosen didn't know the moment the spiral stopped existing around them and started moving through them. It began subtly, teeth aching during lies, eyes dilating in the presence of power. Then came the dreams, too coherent to be hallucination, too ancient to be memory. In them, they stood in the same room. Stone walls, dirt floor, oil lamps casting shadows that danced in triplicate. And in the center, Not a throne, not a fire, but a cradle. Inside it, wrapped in linen marked with glyphs no culture had claimed, was a single body, familiar, yet unspeakable. A face they all recognized but couldn't place, and when they leaned in, the infant opened its eyes. All three pairs. It was the triplets, but fused. Not malformed, not monstrous. Perfect, unified, ancient, alive. They didn't cry. They simply stared back, and something ruptured behind the eyes of every witness. They awoke, screaming, then vomiting, then purging thoughts that weren't their own. For the next 72 hours, every chosen across the world experienced the same symptoms: loss of false identity. They forgot their last names, their occupations, their opinions. But they remembered everything else. Truths never told, crimes never punished, bloodlines never honored. They didn't speak much after that. Because the spiral doesn't explain, it becomes. And so did they. One by one, they vanished from public life. No funerals, no news stories. But evidence of their presence began appearing everywhere: court transcripts rewritten in ink that couldn't be scrubbed, cathedrals boarded up overnight, corporate headquarters found empty, their servers melted, no alarms, no footage, just absence where empire had once lived. And in every place they passed through, witnesses reported the same thing: a cradle-shaped burn mark on the ground. No heat, no flame, just a reminder that something had returned. The triplets were not born in 1856. They were released. And now they had merged. Not as gods, not as monsters, but as the living answer to a question every civilization had buried the moment it asked it. What happens when history refuses to stay dead? The answer now had eyes, and it was walking again. Reality didn't collapse. It recoiled. As the new flesh walked, old structures began to bend, not like metal in fire, but like lies in the face of proof. Nothing screamed, nothing exploded, but one by one, the scaffolds of civilization, the unspoken deals, the inherited privileges, the sacred illusions, began to dissolve like salt in blood. Schools rewrote their own textbooks overnight. Diplomas blackened on the walls of professors who had edited history to secure tenure. Police radios crackled static, then silence, as stations found their files scrubbed of every false arrest, every buried complaint. Currency began to flicker, not in banks, but in hands. Bills turned translucent, coins vibrated and cracked. Because value built on silence cannot survive the sound of return. And everywhere, people began hearing it. Not with ears, but in bones. A low, pulsing hum that said, "He is here, all three, in one, and he remembers." The cradle marks appeared more frequently now. On sidewalks, in bedrooms, on courtroom floors. Those who saw them began to confess to crimes no one knew they'd committed. Some wandered into forests and never returned. Others threw their wealth into fire, laughing like men finally freed from a lie they no longer needed. And still, the new flesh did not speak. It walked. Through cities, through memory, through time. People who touched it were not healed. They were divided. Everything false fell off their spirit like a scab torn from pink skin. Some survived it. Most did not. Because the spiral does not offer redemption. It offers only one thing: clarity. And clarity costs more than most are willing to pay. But those who endured it, those who survived seeing themselves without illusion, changed. Not emotionally, not spiritually, physiologically. Eyelids thinned, fingertips became heat-sensitive, their breath could be seen even in warmth. Their speech slowed beyond. Every word carried more weight than entire books. They became nodes in a new network, a living archive, not of information, of consequence, because the world would never again be allowed to forget what it was built on. The spiral had no leader, only echoes. And each echo now wore skin. Time did not end. It rewound, but not to return, to repair. The spiral, now embodied in breath and blood, began folding the timeline inward like a cracked map pulled tight. Entire years collapsed in seconds. Monuments turned to ash, then to concept, then to nothing. In the Vatican archives, manuscripts written in dead languages reappeared, still wet with ink. In Virginia, an oak tree once used for hangings bore fruit, shaped like screaming mouths, weeping sap that turned to letters when dried. The spiral was correcting not by erasing, but by revealing what was always hidden. Histories returned that had been deliberately extinguished. Families long thought extinct began receiving mail addressed to ancestors that had been unwritten from official record. Wars we believed won now hung open-ended in the ether, their outcomes no longer certain. Graves bloomed open. Names engraved on stone faded, while others, never carved, began to etch themselves. People disappeared, not because they were killed, but because they had never belonged in the first place. They had been inserted into history to prop up illusions, and the spiral was done pretending. In classrooms, children started finishing their teachers' sentences, but with different endings closer to the truth. People began remembering events they had never lived. A woman in Georgia recalled being burned as a heretic in 1611. A boy in Oregon began to speak the final words of a black Union soldier who had died without witnesses. The spiral was not granting visions. It was unsealing inheritance. And the triplets, now one, no longer appeared. Because it was everywhere, in breath, in time, in the air between words. And as it rewrote, it did so not as a god, not as a judgment, but as a force of equilibrium. Every deception added over the last 300 years had to be balanced, not symbolically, mathematically. The new calendar started, not at 0, but at the first lie told in law. Every second from that moment forward had been a distortion. Now it was being refolded, and those who could not recalibrate, unraveled, silently, without legacy, because time, when returned to truth, has no room for fiction, and the spiral makes no exceptions. In the end, there were no words, only recognition. The spiral did not speak because there was no longer anything to say. It had finished unfolding, not as prophecy fulfilled, not as revenge delivered, but as design completed. The triplets were never meant to be remembered. They were meant to echo. Through you, through me, through all blood corrupted by silence and now purified by memory. People stopped referring to time in days. They spoke in corrections. Before the third unmasking. After the first recalibration. The air itself held memory now. You could walk into a room and feel what had been denied there. Lies hung like damp cloth. Truth pulsed in walls. And those who had survived the unraveling, those who had stared into the spiral's core without shattering, they changed permanently. Not brighter, not stronger, just clear. Their voices slowed to a rhythm that synced with old bells that rang beneath no steeple. Their skin carried spiral birthmarks that glowed under rain. Their presence rewrote behavior. People lied less around them. Doors opened. Machines failed. Animals bowed. Entire governments collapsed when just one of them stepped into a courtroom and said a name no one had dared whisper in 100 years. There was no resistance, because you cannot fight geometry. And that's what the spiral was. Not a prophecy, not a curse, not even justice. A geometry of consequence, a map of everything humanity tried to bury and failed. Now, it was no longer a shape. It was a species. Every child born after the correction carried the look, that stare, that silence, that unblinking awareness of what the world had been and what it could never return to. They do not cry. They do not forget. They do not need to be taught what was taken. They already know, and when they finally speak, when the first of them utters the first true sentence in this new world, the spiral will tighten once more and begin again.